Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is August 6th. On this day in 1993, what should have been an ordinary evening at a family-run restaurant turned into a deadly hate-fueled massacre when a Fort Bragg soldier walked into Luigi's Italian Chop House and shattered lives forever. Today, we're revisiting a night of unimaginable horror in Fayetteville, North Carolina, the Luigi's restaurant shooting. Let's get started. It was just past 10 p.m. on a typical summer Friday when 22-year-old Sergeant Kenneth Jr. French pulled his black truck up to Luigi's restaurant. He looked like any off-duty soldier, shorts, a casual shirt, but in his hands were two 12-gauge pump-action shotguns and a .22 caliber rifle. Instead of entering through the front door, French circled to the back. He fired rounds toward the neighboring Kroger grocery store, then slipped through the kitchen entrance of Luigi's. That's when the chaos began. He shouted, "Freeze!" and then started shooting. Panic erupted instantly. Diners dropped forks and wine glasses, they ducked under tables and ran for exits. Some pleaded for their lives. But none were spared his wrath. French moved through the restaurant methodically, firing at random and at times directly into people's faces. Witnesses said he didn't flinch. The violence was sudden and terrifying. By the time the gunfire stopped, 4 innocent people were dead. Pete Parus, 73, the restaurant's beloved owner, who was gunned down while trying to protect his guests. His wife, Ethel, 65, who reached out for him in her final moments. James Kidd, 46, who shielded his son from the gunfire. And Wesley Scott Cover, 26, who died defending his pregnant fiancée. 6 more people were injured. And in just a few horrifying minutes, a peaceful restaurant turned into a war zone. The shooter's motives? Well, as investigators would soon discover, they were deeply rooted in hatred. As the shots rang out, help was already running toward the danger. Lieutenant Bill Simons, an off-duty Fayetteville police officer working security at Kroger, heard the gunfire. And without backup and without hesitation, he sprinted toward Luigi's. He entered through the rear kitchen and saw the devastation. He saw the broken glass, the overturned tables, and people lying wounded and afraid. Then he spotted French, still armed and moving through the dining room. Simons didn't wait. He aimed and fired twice, once in the chest, once in the leg, and brought the rampage to an end. French dropped immediately and was taken into custody. Later, Simons would say he wasn't a hero, telling reporters, quote, "You train for moments like that. I just did what I had to do," end quote. But to the survivors and to the families of those he saved, Simons was nothing short of heroic. He likely saved many more lives that night, in fact, because one diner said it best, quote, "If he hadn't shown up when he did, God knows how many more would have died," end quote. Simons retired 16 years later. At his farewell ceremony, the police chief choked up, calling him, quote, "a man who helped a city heal," end quote. But Simons stayed humble, choosing instead to remember the victims, saying, quote, "The real hero was the father who died shielding his son," end quote. After his arrest, the public learned of French's motive. Witnesses heard him rant about President Clinton's civil rights and military policy. He spewed a hatred toward women, black service members, and LGBTQ+ individuals, people he believed were eroding what he called traditional American values. This wasn't a sudden breakdown. This was a result of months, maybe even years, of stewing anger and radical ideology. Court records later revealed that French had grown increasingly agitated over the military's evolving inclusivity. Those who knew him described him as erratic and obsessed with racist and misogynistic beliefs. The night of the shooting, he'd reportedly spent hours drinking and watching The Unforgiven. He filled his vest with ammo, tucked a beer inside, and headed to Luigi's with murder on his mind. Survivors testified that French didn't just shoot, he stalked his victims. He reloaded calmly, aiming at close range. And his intent was clear. He wanted to punish those he hated. The prosecution labeled it what it was, a hate crime. And while the defense argued that he was drunk, disturbed, and emotionally overwhelmed, the court and the city saw something far more dangerous. A man whose bigotry had turned deadly. In February 1994, French faced trial in New Hanover County, charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of attempted murder, and firearms violations. He pleaded not guilty. The evidence against French was clear, but the defense tried to paint a picture of a man who had been unraveling. He was haunted by family trauma, drowning in alcohol, and spiraling mentally. They claimed that he wasn't in control. But the jury disagreed. After 2.5 days of deliberation, they found him guilty on all charges. However, during sentencing, jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. That meant no execution. But the judge handed down 4 life sentences, 1 for each victim, plus 35 more years for the wounded. At the sentencing hearing, the judge called the massacre, quote, one of the most horrifying acts of hate this community has ever endured, end quote. French would spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of parole. The wounds left behind by the massacre at Luigi's didn't fade. The Perouse family, well-loved Greek immigrants who ran the restaurant with heart and warmth, were devastated. Their son Nicholas would later recall arriving that night and feeling as if, quote, life had just changed forever, end quote. For years to come, the names of Ethel and Pete Perouse, James Kidd, and Wesley Scott Cover were remembered not just as victims, but as people whose lives meant something. The shooting at Luigi's restaurant was a crime born of hate, but the aftermath was filled with love, remembrance, and a shared commitment to never forget. It was a tragedy that reminded us how quickly lives can change and how important it is to stand against bigotry, always. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found today's episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join us again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!